Hello, good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, good evening. Is it okay? I can hear you.
Yes, sir. I can hear you too perfectly well. Okay, wonderful. Good evening to everyone who's joining in. Today's session is going to be about the India-China relations, and we'll try to discuss some of the debates that have sprung up as well. Allow me to introduce our esteemed guest for the evening, Professor Mukul Sanwal, who was appointed to the IAS in 1971 and has served as District Magistrate in 3 districts. He's been Managing Director of 2 corporations, Director of the Training Academy, and Secretary Agriculture in UP, Uttar Pradesh. He was the first head of the Pollution Control Division in the Government of India. He represented India at the Rio Conference in 1992 and was the lead negotiator for the Climate Change Treaty, Agenda 21, and co-chaired negotiations relating to the Rio Declaration. He is a visiting professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, USA, and Tsinghua Uiversity, Beijing, China. A very, very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. To begin with, perhaps we can understand the context a bit better. And when we talk about the border disputes between 2 countries, that is India and China, the first thing that comes to mind is the resolution mechanism. So what are the standard principles in international law to resolve border disputes, if any?
See, the standard principles in international law assumes that there is a dispute. But if you look at the developments that have been taking place and the newspaper reports, you would notice that even while there were incidents at the border, diplomatic as well as military conversations were going on between both sides without needing an intermediary. Now, so this is a very peculiar kind of dispute, and I would really call it more differences on the perceptions of the border rather than a dispute in terms of international law. Because dispute assumes that certain rights have been infringed and you need to resolve them in the context of certain laws or certain agreed principles. But here the big issue is, and that is the point I really want to make, that the problems that have been taking place in Ladakh are a very peculiar kind of problem, because no one, and I repeat, no one, because no one, whether the Tibetans, the Chinese, or the Indians, Kashmir state, the British, no one ever exercised any territorial control over Aksai Chin. Now that is a historical fact. There are no maps in existence with anybody, Beijing, Lhasa, New Delhi, Srinagar, which claim their boundary. The other way in international law of claiming territory is extending civil administration. Now we know that nobody extended their civil administration over Aksai Chin because nobody lives there. There is no water. It's a cold desert. The treaty between the British and Kashmir described it as a barren area of white stones. Nehru told the Indian Parliament that not a blade of grass grows there. There were no major caravan routes either. Now it is in this geographical situation that you have 2 newly independent states trying to establish some kind of international border along the lines of international law. But the context doesn't allow for it because nobody ever exercised any rights over this area.
Right. So it becomes very difficult then to exercise any of the norms or even develop norms in such.
And that is why we have not been able to resolve this problem over all these years.
Right. So in your article, you have also argued that disputes in both eastern and western sectors cannot be clubbed together and they need to be tackled separately. But China did in the past hint at a package of in these both sectors. So how do we approach the matter then?
You see, I think, again, the context is important. Right. From the perspective of the 2 governments in the 1950s, when this discussion started, and the Chinese exerted sovereignty over Tibet, and we extended administration up to the whatever McMahon line or into Ladakh. They were newly independent states exercising their sovereignty and very conscious about their sovereignty. We had just emerged from colonialism, and they had emerged outside the unequal treaties. So both countries were very prickly about their sovereignty. The second issue is that from our perspective, the Ladakh issue of the eastern border is actually the border of Kashmir. And Kashmir had certain connotations in Indian political climate or history at that particular time, and that clouded our judgment. Now, when you look at what actually happened in the negotiations or what happened in the 50s, you find that in the east there was a line, the McMahon line. The British, the Tibetans, and the Chinese had sat together and drew a line on the map. Now, McMahon drew a very thick line on a very small scale map. That is a historical fact. It is also a fact that the knowledge about the topography of the area was not as good as it is today. But there was a line on the map. It was supposed to follow the watershed. It did not. So that is the first point of different perspectives. Then in the central sector, the situation was completely different. That is what is today Himachal and Uttarakhand. Here, the British had extended their civil administration up to the watershed line. So you had revenue settlements, you had maps, and you had British civil administration presence right up to the watershed or the so-called border. But here again now, there was a peculiarity. Now, I have been District Magistrate Almora. I have seen that paper. They are just 2 sheets of paper. One is a letter from the Deputy Commissioner to the Viceroy saying that I'm going to Lipu Lake to open the pass. So obviously that was the border. He went every year to open the pass, so asserted sovereignty. Then he goes on to say that I'm getting reports that the Tibetan Jongmen comes down to Garbeang, which is nearly 70 kilometers inland today, to collect tax. Those who do not pay are tied to a rock and whipped. And I'm told the locals are going to make a complaint to me. What should I do? And there is a reply is there, handwritten. We hope this letter overtakes you before you reach the pass. Do not interfere. If they do not interfere in trade, ignore. See, what we are missing here is that the initial interaction on the northern border was not between a sovereign country and another sovereign country. You had the East India Company here, who were basically traders. They were not conscious about borders, they were not conscious about sovereignty. And at the other end, you had the Tibetans who had Chinese presence there. There was a Chinese official in Lhasa, and so they had some kind of relationship with the Chinese. That is why in the first Chinese assembly that took place, the Dalai Lama participated as a provincial leader. The Indians and the Americans advised him not to go, but he went. So he acknowledged the overall position of the Chinese government. Now, in the eastern sector, it is even more weird, as we would say, in terms of our present context, because you had no such demarcation at all. What you had was something unique to Ladakh. You had an annual trade mission between Leh and Lhasa, which means a caravan went from Leh to Lhasa, and the next year it came from Lhasa to Leh, what they called the Lokchak mission. Basically, it was a trading caravan. It was composed of traders, but it was officially sanctioned. The British Assistant Commissioner was there in Leh. And the interaction continued till 1950s. Then you had Leh was a part of the Kashmir state. And the treaty that the British had with Kashmir, when they created the state with Gulab Singh, was that the eastern boundary would be determined jointly by a representative of the Kashmir state and the British government. So the Treaty of 1842, the Treaty of Amritsar, recognized that there was no eastern boundary to Ladakh. Then you had efforts to create a boundary or to establish a boundary. But nothing was marked on a map. that was accepted by both parties or even accepted by any government. There were lines on the map. There were surveys, partial surveys. But the question is, in this situation, newly independent states were wanting to negotiate a boundary. Now the Chinese made the proposal that we will accept the line in the east. They don't want to accept the McMahon line, because by accepting the McMahon line, they would be accepting a certain status for Tibet. And they were very clear they would not do that. Similarly, if we accepted anything in the past, it would be a certain status to Kashmir, which we did not want.
Right.
So what happened in the 1950s was the Chinese made a proposal, let us accept that line. They accepted that line in Burma, but Nehru refused to negotiate. He said there is no dispute. The boundary in Ladakh is settled by long usage and custom. Repeatedly in Parliament, in the official documents, he kept repeating long usage and custom. But long usage and custom is not what is recognized by anybody in any part of the world. As you referred to international law earlier, it was neither civil administration, nor a map, nor even physical presence of anybody.
Yes.
And then you have, that is why I'm saying that if you link these three problems, you are not going to come to a resolution, because the Chinese have accepted the boundary in the central sector. And again, there are some disputes because of what I explained to you, that the Tibetans were coming to collect tax. Even after independence, they had set up a custom union in the bottom of the valley of Barahoti, and that's a flashpoint today. But they had a custom union. It was flagged by the Intelligence Bureau to the government of India, and then people moved in and said, hey, you can't come across this line. So there has been an element of vagueness, but that is in certain pockets. In Ladakh, there is no element of vagueness because it is not about pockets. And when India was negotiating with China in the 50s, the Indian government defined the areas in the central and the eastern sector as disputed areas or problem areas. Ladakh was defined as a territory. The entire territory was under question. We have used the word territory for Ladakh and areas for the other parts of the boundary. So my point is that the other areas have minor exchanges or minor clarifications. It is in Ladakh that you have to determine something new. And the gazetteer prepared by the British in 1899 again says that the boundary up to the Changchemo Valley is settled, that is in the Galwan region. And the boundary north of that to the Karakoram is not settled. It's recorded by the British. Now, why is the Changchemo Valley or Galwan so important? Because Galwan is the access to Aksai Chin. So it is strategically important for the Chinese.
Right.
And Galwan had a problem in 1950s, in 1960s, and now. So we have to delink the problem relating to a territory and problem relating to clarifications of certain issues. And then I think there can be a resolution.
Absolutely, sir. So, article you also mentioned the Thagla dilemma. So, could you possibly explain that a bit further to us?
You see, the Thagla dilemma is unique. It's an example of the problem, or an illustration of the problem. Because the McMahon line in this Thagla area, that is north of Tawang, the tri-junction between Bhutan, China and India, is almost a straight line. If you look at the small scale maps, but does not follow the ridge line. You can see it. Even on a small scale map, you can see it does not follow the ridge line. And when the posts were being set up, the divisional, I think the corps commander said that we must set up a post on a prominent feature near the tri-junction. Now, all this was happening just around 1962. The Dhola post was set up in June 1962. We had moved into Tawang administratively a little earlier. Now, you see the issue here. Tawang was under the administrative control of Lhasa. The Dalai Lama's representatives were there. The Chinese were moving in from the Chengdu or from the east. Just before that, we moved into Tawang. At Patel's insistence, the Himmat Singh Ji committee was set up. It recommended that we move into Tawan, the Assam Rifles be put onto the McMahon line, and we extend control. Himmat Singh Ji committee also made a report on Ladakh, which has not been released, and nobody knows about it. At least I have come across no reference anywhere to the Himmat Singh Ji committee report. Seems to be a very, very, very closely guarded secret. So we were just moving into this area, administratively, in the military sense, in the policing or intelligence sense. Now, when the post was set up in Dhola, a young major reports. These are part of the reports, and in my article too, written by the generals at that time, the commanding officers, brigadiers, and generals. That he says that I asked the local man of the intelligence bureau where the boundary is, and looked for a prominent feature and set up Dhola post. When he relayed the coordinates of the post, somebody at division headquarters or somewhere down the line, up the line, realized that this post is north of the McMahon line. But they had the coordinates of the McMahon line. And some messages went up and down. What should we do? Ultimately, it seems from what has been disclosed that they said, let's keep quiet about it. Now, so the problem was recognized, and instead of saying, let's put it on this, let's deal with it, it was let's suppress this information. Nehru, when he was going to Colombo, said, I have asked the Indians to throw out the Chinese because Dhola post was surrounded by the Chinese. And they kept saying, look, you're north of the McMahon line, please go back south of the McMahon line. And nobody was prepared to acknowledge on record at that point of time that Dhola post was actually north of the McMahon line. And the rest is history. The point I'm making is that if this is the genesis of the problem, then we need to recognize it and deal with it. Because it's not that there was an aggression, either from our side or from their side. There was a misunderstanding.
Absolutely.
We were not trying to take over the Thagla Ridge, and they were not trying to take over Nifa. So we should recognize it, and we have come to a stage of our development where we can take those decisions. We are a strong power. We can do that. Very
true. You also argued that neither India nor China exercised control over Aksai Chin, but many claim that the Johnson line drawn by the British in 1865 clearly showed the region as part of the revenue circle of the Kashmir state. So what are your thoughts on this?
You see, this is the mirror image of Thagla. The Kashmir administration never extended control over this part. The Johnson line, the genesis of Johnson line is really the Treaty of Amritsar of 1842, which said that the eastern boundary will be determined jointly by the British and the Kashmiri governments. Now, a young surveyor was sent up. At that time, a lot of British activity was taking place in the mountains. There is a famous mountaineer who climbed comets, Eric Shipton. He was trekking out, he was leading expeditions in this area. They needed intelligence, they needed geographical knowledge. They wanted to know what was happening there. So this man led an expedition, and obviously no one was there to oppose him because nobody had exercised any sovereignty over this part. And the sovereignty of the Karakoram Pass was always with Leh. Now this man veered to the left. He went to the Kunjare Pass, went into the Kunlun Mountains, and made some surveys, good survey, and he came back. But he never surveyed the entire area right down to what we call the present boundary of Aksai Chin, because he was not there for that long. He could not have physically traversed that area, and he has not produced any maps of that area either. He has produced a map of the Kunlun Range and said, look, if we should not stop at the Karakoram Pass, we should extend our territory to the east and take the Kunlun Mountains into the territory of Britain. Basically, Kashmir. But neither the Kashmir government nor the British government followed this up. The records show, the records that are out in the public domain, that there was a big debate in the British government, even at that time. Lord Curzon in 1902 records that we should hand this over to China because we want to prevent the Russians from coming in. We don't need this part. The army at that time was saying, we cannot defend this. We can only defend the Karakoram range, and that should be the boundary. So another line was drawn. And it's along the Karakoram range, which is somewhere around what the present line of control, what we call the line of actual control. And that was sent to the Chinese. Now here again comes the complexity. It was not sent from London to Beijing because of the peculiar situation of Leh, which was supposed to be a part of Kashmir. Kashmir was an independent state over which Britain had some control, or some suzerainty or some paramountcy. And this was given by the representative of India in Kashgar to the representative of the Chinese in Kashgar. I mean, you were talking about international law earlier. The question is, where is international law in this? And Ladakh's relationship with the British was via Kalimpong, Sikkim. So you had a very strange situation. The British government and the Beijing government are talking to each other through ambassadors. The government in India is talking to Lhasa through their man in Sikkim. And the people in Leh are talking to the people in Ladakh directly with each other on behalf of the Kashmiris of the Srinagar state. And all this is happening as communication is made to the Kashgar by and to the Kashgar people sitting there, the consulates in Kashgar. They got no reply. The point I'm making is that when you look at the Survey of India maps at the time of independence, this area is shown as yellow wash, undefined. Now here comes the big issue, I think, which remains unresolved. Nehru, coming back from the Bandung Conference, where we talked of peace, where the two governments, India and China, talked of peace, ordered the new maps should be made. A former Foreign Secretary, Nirupama Rao, in her book records, hasn't gone into details of this issue, this key issue. All she says is that Nehru was advised that we must have a map. And someone in the Foreign Office was asked by the Surveyor of India, Surveyor General of India, where should I draw the boundary? And he said, as expansive as possible, the maximum we can draw. This is recorded by her. So we drew the line. Now I come to the key point is that while there was a line, it was never officially recognized. There was no administration was extended. Then came the question around the 1950s and 60s. We started expanding our influence. In NEFA, we set up posts because there was a line. Well, the alignment may be disputed, but there was a line. In Ladakh, there was nothing. So we just had patrolling points. Now you see the difference.
Yes.
Even today, the controversy is not that the Chinese are crossing our line. The controversy is they are preventing us from going to our patrolling points. Now just look at it. Just reflect on this for a minute. We have no line. They have a line. They have claimed some line. They gave a line in 1960. But our line is the one that was drawn on our map unilaterally. And the present dispute is that you are preventing me from going to my patrolling point. Now, how did you set up the patrolling points? What is the basis? And why is it so important? Is not under discussion. And I think that is what we need to discuss. Because not only the British Commander-in-Chief, but it is recorded again in the public domain that General Themaya, this Commander-in-Chief at that time, in the 60s, also said the Karakoram is a defensible boundary. Ex-commanders of the Leh Corps have written articles saying that the Karakoram round is a defensible boundary. Currently, the Foreign Minister has said, I don't object. What has he said? He has said the objection is to the unilateral changes by China. Prime Minister also in the all-party meet after Galwan said, Koi nahi aaya. And that has become a political issue now, that you are accepting that presence. No, the Prime Minister is not accepting that presence. He's basically saying that there is no line from our side. So when there is no line, how can we say somebody has come into our territory? It has so happened that newly independent states, confused, for us, even more confused because of the status of Kashmir. And remember, Gilgit was a part of Ladakh.
Okay.
It was not part of Kashmir. It was administratively a part of Ladakh. And the British delinked it. They connected it with the Northwest Frontier Province. At independence, they asked the Maharaja to post the British Major Brown as commander of the Gilgit Scouts. They had a coup. These people then killed the the Kashmir governor who was sent there, Brigadier Ghansara Singh, and set up the Pakistan flag. And we didn't object to it in the United Nations. The point I'm making is that this whole thing has been framed incorrectly. The facts are not known. But what we know from the facts, one can say very clearly that there is no question of somebody coming into somebody else's territory because nobody ever exercised control over it. It's just a matter of, it's a very different kind of dispute that existed anywhere in the world. And that is why you have this strange spectacle, as I said earlier, that clashes are taking place, military commanders are talking, foreign ministers are talking, diplomatic talks are going on simultaneously.
Right.
I think public opinion has got involved on both sides. It's just a question of time before somebody says, all right, let's cut this problem and deal with it.
Right. There's a definite need to examine this entire situation from its historicity in a more objective lens rather than who claimed what. So the border dispute with China is also inextricably linked to Dalai Lama. Will China accept any deal without state in Dharamshala?
You see, the Dalai Lama issue is also again very peculiar. You don't have a parallel in any other part of the world. That is because of the way the British extended their boundaries or their frontiers or their control, created buffer states. In every other part of the world, a line was drawn on the map when the colonial powers expanded. In Africa, you have the conference of 1885, where they drew lines on the map and said, this is my boundary, this is your boundary, cutting across tribes, cutting across historical facts. In Asia, in this part of Asia, no lines were drawn ever by the British. Because of the nature of the interaction, they were not worried about, the Himalayas were a boundary. Tibet's control, China has always exercised control over Tibet. The initial records of the British East India Company, when they moved into this area, speak of the Chinese Zhongpen, not the Tibetan Zhongpen. Then, when the Russian Empire was expanding, and the British were afraid that the Russians would expand into this part, and that there would be a clash of two empires, they looked at Tibet as a buffer state and created something there. And they switched to Tibetan Zhongpen. That is why in the Simla Conference of 1914, Tibet was also invited. So it was a creation of the British. They were never an independent country. Independent only when China's central power was weak, in the same sense as Kashmir was never an independent country. The British, when they took over Ranjit Singh's Sikh Empire, wanted him to pay reparations. His successors, they had no money. They said, give us Kashmir in lieu of 1 crore of rupees. And they sold it to Gulab Singh for 75 lakhs and created the Kashmir state. So the question is that this part of the, of the world has this strange history. Then we come to the modern times where the Dalai Lama fled to India, not in the 1960s, after 65, but earlier also, when the Chinese started putting pressure on him. Chinese state became strong, started putting pressure on him. Then, while he was in India, the first time and the second time, he was maintaining contacts with the Russians, the British, and Chinese, and the Indians. We know that from the records. Then, when he came here, subsequently, before he came here and the Chinese started having a national assembly, he went there. He had a treaty with the Chinese. Okay. And it was after that treaty that they moved in, the military moved in. Now, this was happening. In parallel, the British had taken an expedition there. They had set up telegraph stations for intelligence. They had posted military units. They had a consulate in Kashgar. They wanted to know what is happening across the Himalayas.
Right.
And they maintained some kind of hold or some kind of presence in Tibet right till 1960s when the Chinese moved in. So this was the status of Tibet, and this was the nature of its interaction with the outside world. Then when the Chinese moved in a bigger way, the foreign hand got more involved. The first message that the Dalai Lama has fled from Lhasa was not to New Delhi, it was to Washington.
I see.
The CIA had a man there. The CIA airdropped supplies because it took him 5 or 6 days traveling at night to come to Tawang from Lhasa. So the Chinese knew this. The Chinese knew this because the Soviets had a mole in the MI605, and they had access to all that information. We were there at a very high level. So they were aware of all this. So we were having, this was the background. Now when the Dalai Lama has come in here, the agreement was that he would not indulge in political activity. And the Chinese accepted that. The issue that is now coming in is that what happens to the successor of the Dalai Lama? Will his group interfere, or the Chinese will deal with it because they are controlling Tibet? And my personal view in this is that just as the stand we have taken with Pakistan, cross-boundary activity has to be limited, or there should be no cross-boundary activity. We are opposing cross-boundary terrorism in the Kashmir area. We should also clearly tell the Dalai Lama that no cross-boundary affair. If you want to, whatever you want to say, you have to leave us and go there. If along with you here, you don't. So the question that is coming up is that it is more the foreign hand is involved directly in this. There are records that the Dalai Lama's brother was involved with the CIA in encouraging an insurrection in China, in Tibet, while he was here in Kalimpong. It's part of the public domain. So I think the government is not, the present government is not going to encourage that. It's not a question of being soft on the Chinese or whatever. It's a question of principle that this government has adhered to very, very firmly.
Right. The dispute resolution itself has been a very long drawn one. You write, the settlement of the border should not be seen through the prism of military deployment, but as a part of the rise of India having the confidence to chart its own course. Do you think that the Indian government should spell out its strategic vision on the border issue more transparently? How do you envision the future to unfold?
I think the government is already doing that, because the central point here is Kashmir.
Right.
The Ladakh issue is a Kashmir issue. It was part of Kashmir state. We have delinked it today.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where I say the present government seems to be going about this problem in a very methodical manner. Because in a sense, this was the Kashmir issue, which if left to Patel would have been handled very differently, was handled by Nehru in a particular manner. We don't want to go into that here. But the question is, Article 370 has been abrogated. Ladakh has been delinked from the valley. Now you can talk to the Chinese without getting involved with any other issue. India has sent a notice on the Indus Waters Treaty seeking its modification after 60 years. I think the significance has been missed. Mm-hmm. It is considered a successful treaty because we were armed with it to give 80% of the water to Pakistan. No other treaty, interstate treaty in the world goes more than 50-50 or in that region. That is the water law. We started by talking about international law. The international law on water, interstate boundaries, sharing of water, the rivers is in the region of 50-50. We gave them 80%. Now, so Prime Minister Modi is questioning that. Mm-hmm. And then when you look at the statements that are coming out, are also moving in the direction of recognizing that, look, we need to settle this not by making concessions, but by recognizing the reality. Well, last week, the former commander of the Indian Army, General Navane, has said. I don't know why this was not highlighted by the media. It is the last line of a media report I saw in the press. He says that, look, today, in the military terms, we are on an equal footing with the Chinese in Ladakh. Infrastructure, deployment, motivation, everything. This is the time to negotiate. As I said earlier, Foreign Minister Jaishankar has said, don't do anything unilateral. But the Prime Minister has said, koi nahi aaya. Rajnath Singh has said the same thing. He said, look, it's not about territory there. So I think a climate is being built up, and it is going, and the government is going about it in a very methodical manner to dismantle or correct the mistakes of the past in this part of India, and I think there will be a resolution soon.
Very well put, sir. So, okay, we can call it a wrap for this session now. But thank you again, sir, for all of your incredible insights. And for those in the audience who are interested in reading sir's articles, they are very much available on our website. And as a side note, we'd also like you to we'd also like you to subscribe to the EPW. And thank you again, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.